Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the George W. Norris Legislative Chamber for the 82nd day of the 108th Legislature first session. Our chaplain today is Pastor Zeke Pfeiffer from the Heartland Evangelical Free Church in Central City, Senator Lippincott's district. Please rise.
Let's pray together. Our triune God, remind us of this day who you are as the only true God, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Father, I am thankful for the men and women that serve our state as representatives. I pray that they would faithfully fulfill their calling from you to uphold what is good and to punish what is evil. You tell us in your word that you raise up leaders for the good of the society and for our welfare, so the rule of law will be upheld. So I pray for your blessing, wisdom, and provision for these men and women. I also pray, Father, that you would protect their hearts and keep their motivations pure. Help them not to be driven by irritation or anger toward those who disagree, nor engage in debate merely with the goal of winning. Rather, I pray that by your enablement, they would be motivated by the good, the true, and the beautiful that is found in you and in your ways. Holy Spirit, we thank you for how you give us understanding of God's holy word. I pray for the men and women of the Nebraska State Legislature that the word of God would be their highest source of truth, direction, and authority. Lord Jesus, our Savior, thank you for your faithfulness and your holiness. We thank you for living a holy, perfect life for us and for dying on the cross to pay the price for our sins. I pray for the salvation of each representative. And if they already experience eternal life through faith in you, I pray for their continued growth and sanctification by your word and your spirit. And finally, Father, I pray for all of us in the state of Nebraska, that we would, as your word instructs in 1 Peter 2, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. Help us, the ones being represented in these halls, to honor these men and women and uphold them in prayer for your name's sake. And it is in the name of Jesus that we pray. Amen.
The pledge today will be offered by a guest of Senator McDonald, Jeffrey Lampe, an Omaha fire captain for 28 years, former U.S. Marine for 4 years, and his wife is under the balcony, south balcony. Please proceed.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I call to order the 82nd day of the 108th Legislature first session. Senators, please record your presence. Roll call. Mr. Clerk, please record.
There's quorum present, Mr. President.
Thank you. Are there any corrections for the journal?
I have no corrections this morning.
Are there any messages, reports, or announcements?
There are, Mr. President. Bills presented to the governor, LB 574E, presented to the governor on May 22nd, 2023 at 7:56 a.m. Additionally, amendment to be printed, Senator Linehan to LB 754A. That's all I have this time, Mr. President.
Senator McDonald has a guest under the south balcony, Nikki Lampy, wife of Jeff Lampy. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Mr. Clerk, first item on the agenda.
Mr. President, first item up this morning, Legislative Bill 514. First of all, Senator Michaela Cavanaugh would move to indefinitely postpone the bill pursuant to Rule 6, Section 3F.
Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, Senator Brewer, you're recognized to open.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. As chairman of the Government Committee, one of the things that we must do is an annual elections cleanup bill. That is what this bill is, and that is why there are 42 pages to LB 514. That is also why it is the government priority bill. It contains mostly minor Election Act updates and tweaks that were requested by the Secretary of State. In this bill, the changes include petition procedures, electronic engineering rules, voter registration, public notice of elections, recall procedures and processes. Besides Secretary of State's office, on this hearing, we also had support from a number of others, to include the Douglas County Elections Commissioner, Brian Cruz, the Hall County Commissioner, Tracy Overstreet, the Nebraska Association of County Officials, and the League of Nebraska Municipalities. Colleagues, this is our job in the legislature, to make this process for government run more smoothly. That is what LB 514 was designed for. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Brewer. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to open on your motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, this is one of my proactive motions, and as much as I love talking, I am going to yield the remainder of my time this morning to Senator Conrad.
Senator Conrad, you have 9 minutes and 40 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you. I want to thank my friend Senator Cavanaugh for the time this morning. As a member of the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee, I have really appreciated serving under the leadership of Senator Tom Brewer and working with incredibly energetic, bright, dedicated, and politically diverse committee on a host of critical issues, perhaps amongst the most important thereof, to ensure and to protect our right to vote. The right to vote is fundamental in a democracy and clearly protected under our federal Constitution, our Nebraska Constitution, a host of supporting statutory frameworks in our federal law and our state law, and further delineated and supported by a host of compelling judicial decisions to ensure that the right to vote, which is sacrosanct, will remain protected. So as we take up one of the most important issues before the legislature this year, I think it's important to just take a quick step back and remember a few things. For about a decade, the Nebraska legislature has stopped, quote unquote, voter ID measures because they found them to be a solution in search of a problem, for one way to put it. We have no documented cases of voter fraud impersonation. We have policies and procedures in place to ensure that our elections remain fair and free of fraud. And knowing that without a compelling reason to restrict the right to vote in any manner, we should not do so. We also know that voter restriction laws have impacts on rural Nebraskans, on young Nebraskans, on Nebraskans who are differently abled, on seniors, and on voters of color. That being said, my friend Senator Slama and others that she was working with decided to go to the people of Nebraska and wage a campaign to change our state constitution in regards to voter ID or voter restrictions. I vehemently and firmly disagree with voter ID. However, I equally find as sacrosanct our duty to facilitate and carry out the will of the people, even when we disagree with it. That being said, the question before us, my friends, is actually quite narrow and quite simple. When you look at the ballot language that the campaign presented to the voters, you look at the text, you look at the ballot title, you look at the explanatory pamphlet that they put forward, it is very clear. The key issues that I anticipate will be part of the debate today will be surrounding vote by mail. Vote by mail does not occur in the constitutional text. Citizenship does not appear in the constitutional text. The question before us is how to implement the will of the voters to ensure that we honor the will of the people so that qualified voters present photographic identification in a manner as specified by us. And we have to do so in accordance with existing federal law, existing state law, and a host of decisions from our courts which tell us how to chart this narrow path. The good news is we don't have to guess. We have sound models from our sister states that show us where the problems may arise and the problems may lie. So we can utilize that information to ensure that we carry out the will of the people. We do not restrict the rights of eligible voters unnecessarily. And we're clear about what Nebraskans want and what Nebraskans' hard-working election officials need to do their job, which I think we can all agree they do very well. The committee amendment that will come before you under Senator Brewer's name has the support of 92 out of 93 hardworking election officials across the state, representing a diversity of geographies and political perspectives. The amendment has the broad support of the government committee, which again, if you look at our membership, you can see that we probably find spirited disagreement on a host of issues, but we were able to come together and find consensus on this critical issue, as is appropriate for our legislative process and should help to guide your decisions before us in our debate today and in the remaining days of the session. No matter what people may have wanted to read in to the constitutional text, that is not relevant. What is before us is a simple textual argument about how to implement this measure. And if you look at the Nebraska Constitution, which we all swore an oath to uphold, the original language and as amended by the constitutional amendment could not be more clear. All elections shall be free. There shall be no hindrance or impediment on the right of a qualified voter to exercise an elective franchise. Before casting a ballot at any election, a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. Colleagues, the other thing that's important to remember as we embark on this debate together is, I know Senator Slama and other members of the body, other members of the public feel strongly that this debate should center upon issues related to vote by mail and citizenship. Those measures, those words do not appear in the constitutional text and are highly governed by other aspects of existing state and federal law. So we need to remember that we're not working within a vacuum as well. There are, as it is appropriate to be, serious criminal penalties for voters to cast a vote if they are ineligible for any reason. There are serious criminal penalties on the books for those that would aid and abet ineligible voters from participating. We have to remember that these issues are already governed with significant and serious penalties throughout our statutory, legal, constitutional, and case law framework. The measure before you in the committee amendment is the most thoughtful approach to ensuring we facilitate the will of the voters. We ensure that our hardworking election commissioners have a path to implement this measure in enough time before the 2024 elections to train and educate election workers and our citizenry in an appropriate way about these changes. Thank you, Mr. President. And to ensure that we do not spark costly, lengthy civil rights litigation that have plagued our sister states and that would impede the implementation of this important measure. The path before us is clear and it is narrow. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator Raybold, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, fellow Nebraskans out there watching us on TV. I think Senator Conrad did an excellent job summarizing the work of the Government Affairs Committee. And it is such a true statement that seldom did we agree completely on anything except putting forward this voter identification bill that will not impede voters from exercising their constitutional right to vote. So I do want to thank Senator Brewer and his leadership. Most importantly, it was established right from the very beginning of the hearings that we were going to stay however late it took, however long it took, to make sure each and every individual that wanted to testify had the opportunity to do so. And that is something I am certainly proud of our committee. No one was turned away because every voice matters, just as every vote matters. And I want to thank Senator Brewer for guiding the discussion, the dialogue, and making sure that that was implemented to allow everyone the opportunity to testify. I want to thank the committee because I know that we worked hard, we stayed late, we listened to all the concerns from so many people of a broad spectrum of folks from all across our state of Nebraska. We heard impassioned pleas from those who felt that there is a lot more work to do with our elections to make sure that they're safe and secure, free and fair. They presented ream after ream of concerns about the integrity and fraud that they were seeing in our voting system. We had the same group except expressing that we are proud of how we have delivered on our voting rights in our state of Nebraska. We heard from election commissioners, we've heard from clerks, we heard from the Secretary of State in their efforts and outreach. We heard mostly from the polling workers who shared with us how proud they were. They felt it was their patriotic duty to make sure anyone who came in the polling place had that opportunity to vote, and they wanted to make sure that they abided by all and every single one of the rules and regulations. So I want to thank all those folks that came out with their impassioned pleas and their data. But the one thing that I can say, working with the Secretary of State, we are so proud of the lack of voter fraud in our state of Nebraska. We heard so many concerns and suggestions about how to make voting even better. We heard from a great suggestion, let's make the election day a holiday so everybody gets a day off. We heard other suggestions saying we need to have cameras in every single polling place all across the state of Nebraska. We heard suggestions, let's make an upgrade so that the polling places are readily accessible and ADA compliant. I do have to say a special thank you to 92 of the counties who spent the time, their election commissioners or their county clerks, providing their comments, making suggestions on all of the amendments put forward on voter identification, so we can make it the best and the safest in our state of Nebraska.
One minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. They work tirelessly to dig down deep into the logistics and details of implementing something like this, to the actual size of the provisional envelopes, to make sure that those provisional envelopes can still fit in the ballot box. So they deserve a tremendous amount of credit for their very important input on how to make this voter ID program acceptable. And I want to say that we're very proud that this will have a robust educational outreach, not only training for all the counties to execute on this, but for our voters themselves. How do they go about voting? Vote by mail or voting at your favorite polling place? So the one element I'll leave you with, there's a dramatic difference in the cost. We know that voting is precious and we should do everything we can
That's
to
your
make.
time, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Raybold. Senator Slama, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. And good morning, colleagues. I rise today opposed to the voter ID amendment that will be proposed later on in this debate. And I just want to take a brief moment to give a lay of the land of where I expect this debate to go today. You should each have a binder on your desks outlining where I'll be with my arguments in comparing the Evnen amendment, which will be brought for your consideration later, and also my own amendment, which is a bit later down on the agenda, but I'm hoping to get to it as well. AM 1777 is the original number of this amendment. It's slightly of my own amendment. It's slightly different now, given that we're on not my own bill, LB 535, but 514. But it is my amendment that you can see online if you're looking for the exact number. I believe it's like 1802. As you are aware, the voters of Nebraska passed Initiative 432 to require a photo ID to vote. Nebraskans have spoken, and it is now our responsibility as legislators to ensure that only the votes of eligible voters are counted and to protect public confidence in the integrity and legitimacy of our representative government. This puts us in line with 35 other states in the United States. Just to be clear, my amendment is the document that lays out the provisions of LB 535 that I am asking the legislature to consider and adopt. First and foremost, I understand the importance of ensuring that all eligible voters in Nebraska have access to the necessary identification. It is also important that everyone who has the right to vote can vote. With this said, LB 535 defines the forms of currently existing photographic identification, including a Nebraska driver's license or state ID card. The state ID card, if you're wondering, would be issued for free. This is true across both amendments. This also includes a receipt for a state driver's license or ID, which the DMV is now required to put photographs on. And this also includes expired IDs, a U.S. passport, an ID issued by a state agency or political subdivision, including colleges and universities, that complies with the bill's opt-in process. The bill requires these entities to offer this. An ID issued by the United States Department of Defense, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs, the VA, or a Native American Indian tribe or band recognized by the United States government, nursing home IDs for those on Medicare and Medicaid, a certificate issued by the Secretary of State for those who have no other means to get an ID. Additionally, religious exemptions were required by case law are also considered in LB 535. Even if Nebraskans do not already have these forms of identification, we have worked with the Secretary of State's office to provide a free option for obtaining a photo ID and ensuring that information about these options is widely available to the public, including adding provisions that include the requirement of the Secretary of State to designate an individual to help voters who do not have IDs obtain IDs and help get the necessary documents to obtain the ID. The Secretary of State's office must pay any fees associated with this process to ensure it is free to the voters, including the documentation necessary to obtain a state identification card. Furthermore, my amendment to LB 514 also lays out the increased responsibilities of the Secretary of State's office, including the new provisions relating to voter identification. This includes various public awareness campaign-related provisions, such as a dedicated website and a mailing postcard to every registered voter who does not have valid photographic identification. This is crucial to ensure all Nebraskans are made aware of these changes. In addition to what qualifies as a form of valid photo identification and how one may obtain a free valid photo identification, I will go into the process of how thank you, Mr. President. I'll come back to that later on my next turn on the mic, and if you can't tell, I will be taking time today. I'm not going to set the world on fire because I'm on doctor's orders to not have a large adrenaline rush, or I could end up back in the hospital. But the lay of the land is this. Those who have opposed voter ID and done everything they can to block voter ID and the implementation of voter ID are now in control of voter ID. Look at the groups supporting the Evnen Amendment. Look at the groups who are now opposing this amendment. I'm the person who was a spokesperson for Citizens for Voter ID. I stand opposed to this amendment for constitutional concerns that I will outline during my turns on the mic today. And I'm asking you to listen to my arguments and vote against cloture on this with your heart. Listen to my arguments, listen to my constitutional opposition to this amendment. I'm going to lay out the process and procedure and how this process and procedure has failed Nebraskans and how you can stand up for the voters of Nebraska by voting against this. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Conrad, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. And again, good morning, colleagues. I want to extend my gratitude to Senator Slama for providing this significant body of work in regards to supporting materials to advance her position. I know that she has been working very hard to bring forward a variety of different amendments and proposals to the members of the government committee. And I don't want that to, of course, go unnoticed. And we're all very grateful to see her back with us today and want to ensure that we each operate as thoughtfully as possible in regards to when any member is facing a medical hardship or issue. So having started my family when I was a member of this body before, I definitely appreciate and understand some of the additional challenges that Senator Slama is facing in the remaining days of our session. And I think that hopefully also goes to show that even if we have diametrically opposite viewpoints on a host of different political issues, we can and we should continue to recognize each other's humanity, which binds us together in society and, of course, here within this legislative body. So the one thing that I want to reiterate, and my friend Senator Raybould just ran out of a little bit of time in regards to some of her opening comments as a member of the government committee, but we have to look at the legal issues, the policy issues, and the practical issues of any measure before us. And particularly on a measure as critically as important as carrying out the will of the people and protecting the fundamental right to vote, which is the bedrock upon which all our civil rights and civil liberties rest in many, many sense. As one factor that the government committee looked at, of course not dispositive, but one measure that Senator Raybould just ran out of time to talk about was looking at the overall price tag and cost in terms of the different options and proposals before the government committee. So the amendments that Senator Brewer is carrying on behalf of the committee estimated, I think, approximately about a $2 million price tag to implement. And that includes getting the materials together, a training components, and a robust voter education campaign, which is very important as part of implementing these changes. Senator Slama's proposal had a fiscal note of, I believe, approximately about $20 million or so. I know her latest version attempted to address the fiscal considerations in consultation with committee counsel and other stakeholders. I think rather than removing that significant fiscal note, it seemed to shift it from prior versions from the counties back into the state. So, of course, the fiscal note itself should not be dispositive in terms of anybody's vote in regards to the approach moving forward, because we're talking about the right to vote, which I think Senator Slama, myself, and others would agree is in fact priceless. But that is one component that we do need to make sure is clear for the record. The other thing that I think it's really important to note again is that we don't have to and should not embrace a novel approach. Thank you, Mr. President. When it comes to something as important as honoring the will of the people and ensuring no eligible voter is turned away. So we have to carefully set the boundaries which exist in our constitutional law, in our statutory law, and in our case law. And that is a careful and delicate balance. But that path has been charted in the committee amendment to ensure that we stay within the bounds of the law, we honor the will of the people, and we do not put up hindrances or impediments to eligible voters being able to cast a vote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Senator Slama, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning again, colleagues. I'm grateful Senator Raybould and Senator Conrad mentioned the cost associated with my amendment, because it really gives us a chance to talk about the procedure and what has happened in negotiations on my amendment for voter ID. The language that the Secretary of State used to point to my amendment costing $23 million or whatever it ended up being was language that they demanded had to be in my amendment of the bill. Now, of course, this was pointed out during an executive session in which I was not invited, in which the Deputy Secretary of State for Elections, Wayne Benna, was inappropriately present. That executive session and the vote taken there was actually thrown out because of the inappropriate presence of the Deputy Secretary of State and the interference with the legislative branch in that executive session. So they pointed at that language saying that it would cost $23 million. I took out the language, and now somehow my bill, like, honest to God, if somebody can point to the line where this bill costs $20 million, I'll take it out. Like, it's not a problem. But it just goes to the moving targets and lies that I've had to put up with when negotiating this bill. Like, this end result of Civic Nebraska pointing at this as being the least worst option and the Democratic Party endorsing this amendment and those opposing voter ID getting on board with this amendment was always planned to be the end result. And that cost discussion really drives home that point. But I think it's important that we talk about the legislature's task given to it by the people of Nebraska. In Initiative 432, the people of Nebraska passed a new requirement for voting in Nebraska. That requirement was added to the Nebraska Constitution with the following language. Before casting a ballot in any election, a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. A qualified voter clearly means that requirement applies to all qualified voters. The legislature only gets to decide the manner in which voters show their ID, not whether or not they have to. Like, let's be clear about that. The amendment being presented before us is voter ID without voter ID. The U.S. Supreme Court has said there are certain groups that must be exempt from showing an ID or have accommodations to help them get ID. They are people who cannot get a birth certificate to get an ID, people who cannot afford to pay for a birth certificate to get an ID, homeless individuals who do not have an address to get an ID, and people with religious objections to being photographed. So when we combine the task given to us by the people of Nebraska with the voter ID accommodations required by the U.S. Supreme Court, a Nebraska voter ID law may only include certain exceptions and accommodations for those four groups. And the legislature's task is to determine how everyone else will show their photo ID. Secretary Evenen's amendment violates the Constitution by going well beyond that and exempting many, if not most, voters from actually showing an ID when they come in to vote. My own amendment is well drafted after consulting all United States Supreme Court holdings related to voter ID law, after consulting many experts in the area of voter ID law, and after comparing similar voter ID laws in other states. Simply put, my amendment doesn't reinvent the wheel and it doesn't try to. My own amendment does exactly what the people of Nebraska intended this legislature to do. And I'd like to take a moment now to shift my attention to the Evnen amendment that you all will be considering, I assume, before my own, and just hit on some of the constitutional issues with this amendment. And you can also see a better, thank you, Mr. President. You can also see a better clarification of these constitutional issues in your amendment. And just to preview, I won't actually be able to flesh these out. Section 5, sections 10 and 11. Section 12, section 17 through section 19, and section 23 all have constitutional issues that I will examine and dig deeper into on my next turn at the mic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Slama, would you like more time? I'll yield my time to Senator Slama. Thank you.
Senator Slama, you have 4 minutes, 50 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I think it's important to note that as I'm talking through this, I'm not blaming anyone on the government committee at all. I consider a lot of members of the government committee on both sides of the aisle to be my very close and very dear friends. However, this process left a lot of them out of the loop, and several of them actually came up to me afterwards wishing that they had been able to have more information for me on my own amendment, which, given the circumstances, I completely agree with. So I'm taking this opportunity not to go after the government committee or go after any one person in particular, but I am referring to this as the Evnen Amendment because the Secretary of State drafted it. Like, the Secretary of State was the one who gave the committee the language to get it drafted. So that's why I'm framing this the way I am. It's important to note the executive branch's involvement in this amendment and how it was drafted. So first off, Section 5 of the Evnen Amendment, it violates the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, which you've got a handy glossary at the end of your binder, which defines the NVRA, and it can give you a little bit more information if you'd like to search on that more later. So Secretary Evnen said that he would use Section 5 of AM 1748. 1748 is the previous version of the Evnen Amendment as attached to 535. We're now on 514. I'm not sure what number amendment it actually is now. When people register to vote so as not to prevent non-citizens from getting on the voter rolls in the first place. However, that is not what his amendment does. Section 5 of AM 1748 states, the Secretary of State shall develop a process to use the information in possession of or available to his or her office to match and verify the citizenship of the corresponding registered voter. Now, the key words here are registered voter. This use of the term registered voter rather than applicant or some other term clearly shows that it only applies to somebody that is already registered to vote. Removing someone who is already registered to vote without a conviction is a clear violation of the National Voter Registration Act, 52 U.S. Code 20507A3, indicates that a registered voter can only be removed from the voter rolls in 4 situations. The voter requests to be removed, the voter died, the voter moved and certain criteria were met, or the voter was convicted of a crime that disqualifies them from voting. A simple citizenship check using DMV data prior to removing a person from the voter registration rolls does not meet any of these situations. That is why my amendment requires investigation and prosecution. The Secretary's amendment is a clear violation of the NVRA and represents a huge threat to our voters to be taken off voter rolls without their knowledge, without notification, and without the ability to express their rights under the NVRA. Sections 10 and 11 place undue burdens on the fundamental right to vote. Sections 10 and 11 of Secretary Evans' amendment is unconstitutional because the affidavit requirement is confusing and ambiguous, and that's relevant. Like, that's not just a subjective assessment. Like, this is relevant for the court case I'm going to talk about, and couldn't even pass rational basis review, which any second-year law school student could tell you is nearly impossible to do, which is kind of impressive. Under both the United States Constitution and the Nebraska State Constitution, voting has been found to be a fundamental right, and I think everybody on this floor would agree that it is. Burdens on the fundamental right to vote are subject to two different levels. Thank you, Mr. President. Two different levels of scrutiny depending on the burden imposed. The level of review relevant here is the rational basis review. In a case directly on point, the Missouri Supreme Court found that a confusing and ambiguous affidavit failed rational basis review and was therefore unconstitutional. AM 1748 on the affidavit says that a voter who has a reasonable impediment to voting does not have to show an ID, but it does not define what a reasonable impediment is. The voter has to fill out an affidavit claiming a reasonable impediment, and I'll come back up to this on my next turn on the mic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Hansen, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I think since I know Senator Brewer and Senator Slama very well, I also know not to get in between both of them when they're debating about something and caught in the middle. So I'm going to do my best to be as even-keeled as I can, but I do have a question for Senator Slama if she would yield.
Senator Slama, would you yield to a question?
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Slama. I'm just trying to actually get some clarification, probably from each of you, about the validation of the voter.
Yes.
From my understanding, in your amendment, it's a registered voter who validates the ID? Or the person?
Yes. So when you're talking about vote by mail, the person who validates the ID needs to be either, so witness attestation is one option that has to be a registered Nebraska voter. On the other hand, you can use a notary, and that's an issue that we use to address the problem of out-of-state voters, military voters. And the great part about the notary side is every uniformed person in the United States military, whether reserve or active duty, qualifies as a military notary and fulfills that requirement.
Okay, perfect. I'm asking these questions because these are some of the questions that I'm getting from constituents a little bit, but because they're trying to listen to both sides debate and where both you are coming from. Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Brewer, would you yield to a question?
Senator Brewer, would you yield to a question?
Yes.
So likewise, kind of very similar or same kind of question. With your portion of the bill, who validates the ID of the individual as opposed to a registered voter?
All right, we probably need to understand the issue of this attestation. So otherwise, signature, you have someone who looks at your ballot and says, yes, this is you, and signs that. And so we have the signatures. As opposed to the committee amendment, which has the use of the identification number to identify that that person is who they say they are and are eligible to vote. The challenge you have with the signature part of that is well, for one, you have to find someone that is going to be willing to sign off on that. You're going to have to be able to verify a signature. Imagine how difficult that is to validate signatures as opposed to simply looking at a number that then is in a database. You go to that database and it says this is the individual, and then it's in that database, the picture and the name, and it's just a much cleaner, a much easier way to validate that that person has had someone show the ID when they send in the mail-in ballot.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I appreciate both responses from both senators, not just for my own mind, but for my constituents' mind as well, as the difference between the thought process from both senators, which I wholeheartedly trust both of them, and they're both very smart individuals when it comes to this topic. And so I'm actively listening to both sides, and as we move along here, I'll do my best to make up my mind. So thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Brewer, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I got to tell you, I did not look forward to today. We have been working voter ID since almost the very first day. I consider Senator Slama a very good friend, and we have worked back and forth to try and come to a solution. Please understand, this is not a Bob Evans amendment. He has helped us. He has showed us what we need to do to make sure that, for one, he can execute what we're being tasked as far as voter ID. But this is a committee bill, and you're going to see a lot of titles put to it. I just ask that please understand that we had an exec. It was voted out. I did ask a representative from the Secretary of State's office to come in because we had serious questions. And shame on me if I don't consult the Attorney General. Shame on me if I don't spend some time understanding the impact on the Secretary of State's office of a bill that we write. We're going to go through a lot of debate today, and I'm put in a horrible position because I'm going to have to go and retrieve all of the history of what we've gone through in the 109 days between this bill being presented to committee and us voting it out a second time in 2 days. But please don't doubt that this is a committee bill. It was voted out on LB 53580. We did it 2 days in a row. If there was issues, we talked about them, we worked through them, we tried to figure out the best solution. And I'm not saying it's a perfect bill, but I think it is a better bill. And it is what we have to do in order to fulfill our obligations to the people of Nebraska. And whether we like it or not, we're out of time. And if we decide that this is such a horrible bill that we can't deal with it, then we will be in special session. There is no way around that. We are out of time. And part of that's my fault. I should have forced this issue sooner. I kept believing that we would find a solution, that we would be able to come to a compromise. And we had long meetings. The speaker was very generous in offering his office and his time and to kind of help coach and work through with the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, a representative from the governor's office, and all the parties involved to try and figure out what right looks like and how we can get there. Unfortunately, we didn't get there, and we ran out of time. The committee made a decision, a hard decision, and that's what you see before you in 514. So I would ask that you understand the difficulties and the complications that went into this, and not to look at it as a bill from any one particular group or anything else. This is the committee process. This is how you get legislation crafted. It should not be one person's thoughts or emotions. It should be what's best for the state. So I will ask that as we go through today, we're going to go into more detail with the bill. Please listen, but keep in mind that we have some very limited opportunities here to move forward with this bill and prevent a special session and meet the requirements that the people gave us in the constitutional amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Brewer. Senator Slama, you're recognized to speak. This is your last time on the motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. And before I hop back into constitutional issues with the Evnen Amendment, I do think of Senator Brewer as an amazing friend. When I was appointed, he was literally the first person to take me under his wing and show me the ropes. And I don't look forward to this day any more than he does. This is not a fight I wanted to have publicly. But at the end of the day, this does come down to process. 109 days of negotiations ended up being done It ended up being thrown away in one fell swoop with an amendment that was not worked on in consultation with anyone who worked with Citizens for Voter ID, any group focused on election integrity. So yeah, we can talk about process, and I can come back with all of the times that the Secretary of State was giving me amendments and slow walking me on issues that ultimately ended up with us being here today. And I will be the first person to say, I'm just as committed to not doing a special session on this issue as anybody else. And here's my thing. We have the choice to either block cloture on this bill today, which you might not choose to do, and fix three things that I'm going to outline with the Evnen Amendment. Fix three things. I'm going to be very clear about what I'm asking for here. Or we can vote for cloture, take the easy way out on this one, and we will be back in a special session, because I'm telling you right now, if you listen to the constitutional objections I have to this bill, it does not follow the plain language of the constitutional amendment. It will end up in court and it will lose. And we will be back here again in special session, because unlike everything else besides the budget, we are constitutionally obligated to put together a framework in this session that fulfills the will of the voters. And that's something I take really seriously. So for me, from my perspective, I'm asking for three simple things, three simple changes to be made to this Evnen Amendment. First and foremost, strengthening the citizenship check requirements. Under this current AM, the Secretary of State is only requiring citizenship checks of the voters with data that they already have access to. This is through the DMV Motor Voter Program. This only covers a slight majority of those voters in the system. Moreover, the language that I talked about in my first constitutional objection on Section 5, the process of removing voters off the registration rolls without any due process, that needs to be fixed. And I think that's just a good governance change that needs to be made. So that's point one. Point two is we have to include witness attestation or notary on mail-in ballots. The argument that this language somehow doesn't include mail-in voting is bogus. Mail-in voting is voting. Like, to even claim that mail-in voting somehow gets a special exemption because it's a different type of voting, it doesn't hold up in any of the 35 other states that have voter ID. I'm asking that you include witness attestation and the notary combo, which is used by over a dozen other states. Nebraska has adopted strict language when it comes to voter ID. And we have to look at the states that have strict voter ID. We can't look at the states that have non-strict language. To Senator Hansen's point, when it comes to verification of those IDs, my amendment has that language with witness attestation and notary. The Evnen Amendment does not verify those IDs as being valid. It doesn't. You can say they do. You can say the Secretary of State's going to develop a process, but that specific language is not in the bill. So it's just a hope and a prayer that he's actually going to do it. Now, third, and I think most importantly, we have to address the reasonable impediment language. Right now, a voter can walk in on election day.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. And say, well, I have a reasonable impediment to voting. And their county election clerk will hand them a sheet with at least 3 reasons. They can include an other box that can be all encompassing. And as long as they check one of those boxes, they don't have to show an ID in order to vote. If a person has a religious objection to being photographed, we're going to take it on a hope and a prayer that they're telling the truth. And moreover, we're not going to make them show any ID. And this breaks from every other state that has strict voter ID language. I'm saying we need to clean up that reasonable impediment language, clean up the language that says we can only get birth certificates and help Nebraskans vote with documents if they were born in Nebraska, because that is a clear violation of the 14th Amendment and the Equal Protection Clause. I'm asking for those 3 things. So until we get movement on those 3 things, I'm not moving. Y'all might decide to go around me, and that's okay, but I'm telling you
That's
right
your
now,
time.
we're going to be in a special session. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Blood, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Fellow senators, friends all, I stand opposed to Senator Kavanaugh's motion and will likely be in support of Senator Brewer's bill with his amendment, which I won't refer to as the Evnen Amendment. You know, friends, if you've listened to this floor since I've been here, I've always said that I I think we need to make it easier for people to vote, not harder for people to vote. So I'm going to have a really difficult time listening to this debate and some of the things that are going to be said, because I believe that voting is a fundamental right. And what's really unfortunate is for some reason, it does not have clear constitutional protections. And I think that that's just truly unfortunate. But when I say right, it also suggests the ability that vote has been given to us without a fight. And that certainly is not true, especially for minorities, especially for women, for people of color, for people who have immigrated to our country. But when we say words like privilege, it makes it sound as if we should only enjoy the right to vote if you are worthy. You're worthy of this privilege, and not others. And now we're going to have this weird patchwork election rules that are blanketed from state to state. And unfortunately, whether you believe it or not, we are going to disenfranchise millions of possible voters across the country. And we have already seen this in other states. But that's not going to change the fact that the voters have asked us to address this issue. But how we address this issue has to be that we do the least amount of harm as possible. I hope we use the word responsibility instead of privilege, instead of right, because it is our responsibility as Americans to vote. In Australia, they've instituted mandatory voting. But based on this definition, for some bizarre reason, in the United States, we look at this as an opportunity to allow irresponsible people to vote who don't care enough about voting, and they're going to go to the polls anyway, and they don't care because they're not going to get fined or anything. And that's just kind of silly. I think about how we got to this point. You know, many of you read the Omaha World Herald article quite a while ago, where I was literally walking to Bed Bath & Beyond, and a young man came up to me and says, I work for the state of Nebraska, and I have this petition that I need you to sign that's going to make it easier for people to vote. So the person lied to me twice, and I found out in that same article that he lied to another previous senator at their door, who was, by the way, a different party. So the fact that we're to this point through deception sticks in my craw. And I'm going to just talk about it one time, and I'm not going to get back on the mic and talk about it. But any other petition drive, be it medical marijuana or something that would have given people more rights to vote, had somebody been deceptive and lied to the petitioners, that page would have been eliminated from the petitions, because that's how it works in Nebraska. To my knowledge, that never happened, that all of those signatures were accepted. So I want you to be thinking about these things, about how we got to this point. There's never been any fraud proven, but we're trying to address that. But the way this legislative session is going, I'm not surprised that we're trying to fix something that's not broken. Do I believe that we should have guardrails in place? Sure.
1 minute.
Do I believe that only citizens of the United States should vote? Absolutely. But I just, again, want to remind you of how we got to this point and what's at stake. And I feel that the government committee worked hard together, keeping that in mind and trying to make sure that people have the ability to vote without creating unnecessary hurdles, without making it harder than it needs to be. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Blood. Senator Bostman, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Nebraska. Good morning, colleagues. Just want to talk about one thing that Senator Salama said before, just so I understand, I think so we all understand if this would carry through, how that would be addressed. When I was on active duty, I was a federal notary. I worked in the JAG office, the Judge Advocate General's office. Not always where we were at or where we were deployed or where different service members were deployed was there a notary. Was there someone who could notarize a document for a military member? So with that, I guess that's one question I would have with this to address that challenge that we may have. As you deploy, when we deploy folks, we do go through a deployment line. We do things such as power of attorneys. We do things as wills, those type of things. It possibly then, but if you're deploying out for a year or more into an area, and then you go to, and maybe Senator Brewer or maybe Senator Holcroft can speak to this more, you get deployed to a certain area, but then from there you get deployed again. And so you get sent out as a unit into another area, another place in that country, and you don't have that same access to notaries that are there. So I'm only bringing this up just as a concern is what we've seen. Being overseas, being at remote locations, that might be an issue for some of our military members, that they would not have access to a notary public in order to have their signature, the request notarized and sent in. That might be a challenge that we have that we may need to address. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Bostoman. Senator Dungan, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I rise today just generally trying to better understand LB 514 as well as the various amendments we have. Obviously, we're coming off of a very long and stressful week, and I don't think a lot of us have had as much time maybe as the government committees had to review this, and so I'm trying to get up to speed based on conversations I've had with folks about the government committee's amendment as well as Senator Slama's amendment. I wanted to take a step back, though, and talk a little bit about the process. You know, we heard from Senator Slama the process here is part of the issue she has with it, and I think some of the things she's been concerned about. Based on the conversations that I've had with folks from both parties in the government committee, I think that thus far I've been really, I think, excited and generally optimistic that the amendment that we see hypothetically presented here soon as the committee amendment really does show a bipartisan effort to both enact the language of the law that the citizens of Nebraska voted on, as well as do so in a way that's responsible for our elections to ensure that as many people have the opportunity to vote as possible. Regardless of how individuals felt or feel about the ballot initiative that we had to deal with this last time with regards to voter ID. The fact of the matter is we find ourselves in a situation where that voter ID law has to be enacted. And so I think the question before the body today is whether or not we're going to enact that in a way that is exclusive or inclusive. And what I mean by that is we have to make a decision as to whether or not we want such stringent requirements that people who would otherwise be eligible to vote are excluded by virtue of a bunch of hoops that you have to jump through, or do we want to ensure that we adhere to the language of the law and create a law that so long as you meet the minimum requirements to vote, you are included in such a way that you are able to continue to participate in the elections. I would rise also to echo the sentiments of many of my colleagues who have spoken and those who have not, that voting is a fundamental right. And I am of the fundamental belief that we should be doing everything we can to encourage more people to vote. Election after election, we look at the numbers of people who turned out, whether it's presidential, whether it's local, and we see news story after news story about how sad it is that more people aren't voting. We lament it amongst ourselves. The news laments it. People are curious why more people didn't turn out. And if that is a consistent concern we have, voter turnout, I think we should be doing everything in our power to ensure that more people can vote and do vote rather than create incentives to get them to stay home. I know from speaking with friends of mine who are generally political people that even they can from time to time forget to vote in a primary because they got busy, or they can say they wanted to vote, but there was enough of a line at the election, at the polling place, or they just got so busy they weren't able to do it. And so when you start to talk about introducing additional requirements, especially when you're talking about things that take extra proactive steps like requiring a notary signature or things such as that, the fear that I have is that we are creating further disincentives for individuals who otherwise would participate in the democratic process to actually follow through. Voting is good. We want more people to vote. We want the voices of more people to be heard. And so I believe that whatever law we enact should be done with the spirit and intention of being inclusive rather than exclusive. Now, the argument that we hear oftentimes with regards to why we need to enact these laws is voter fraud. And that's a conversation that was had quite a bit in this last election cycle. But what we also know is that based on every empirical study that's been done, voter fraud is incredibly rare. The specific kind of voter fraud that's addressed by voter ID, which is in-person voter impersonation, is even rarer. Two studies I know that were done in Washington. Thank you, Mr. President. Washington and Ohio back in the 2000s revealed that voter fraud rates that they studied were 0.0009%, and a subsequent study was 0.00004%. I mean, at that point, we're talking about almost infinitesimal numbers. And so when you weigh the consequences of implementing requirements that are going to de-incentivize otherwise eligible voters versus these infinitesimal numbers that we've seen with regards to studies of actual in-person voter fraud, the benefits and the costs become unbalanced. And so I absolutely think that we should be including more voters. I think voting is important. We should be hearing the voices of more people and finding ways to bring folks who are disenfranchised into the system rather than creating red tape for them to cut in order to access their ballot. And so generally speaking, again, I'm listening to these amendments. I want to find out more about what's being included. But
That's your time.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Dungan. Senator John Kavanaugh, you are recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I guess I don't know where I stand yet, colleagues. I'm sitting here reading what I assume is the committee amendment. Let's see, AM 1801, that's being presented by the committee and Senator Brewer. And I haven't gotten a chance to read Senator Slama's proposal yet. I have looked through the binder you, Senator Slama, provided, and I appreciate it being broken down in an easily digestible way. But as Senator Dungan was talking about, this is an important issue and we want to do it the right way. And some of us haven't had as much time to think about these particular proposals and digest them. And I did particularly appreciate Senator Bosselman pointing out the hurdle to getting a notary for some of our deployed military personnel. And I think we certainly want to be sure that we're not creating a structure that's going to disenfranchise our service people while they're serving. I don't know, honestly, Senator Bosselman, I appreciate you raising that issue. I don't know where that comes up in either one of these amendments at this point, but I'll be on the lookout for where that issue is raised. I'm just as I was sitting here reading it, I did have a question. I guess I'll ask it rhetorically because I don't want to put anybody on the spot because I don't fully understand it, but it's in AM 1801. Section 10 talks about filling out provisional ballots, and it does set out some nice, clear criteria for how someone can still vote if they don't have an ID on them when they go to their polling place on election day, or to the election commissioner for an early vote, and how they can cure that by showing their ballot or showing their ID at a later date, and then also the attestation they have to give for saying they're not voting in any other way, they're not voting other places. But one of my concerns about it is, and I might be wrong about this, like I said, I just started reading this, but my understanding is currently, if someone shows up at a polling place, at a particular precinct, maybe where they used to vote, and then the lines got redrawn, and they're now in a different precinct, if they show up at the wrong precinct, they'll still be able to vote a provisional ballot at that precinct, even if they don't show up as a registered voter there. And this would seem to require that for someone to vote a provisional ballot, they have to be on the voter rolls at that particular precinct. So I don't know if I don't think that's an intentional change, and I don't know if it actually supplants that other language. I don't know where that language is. I'll continue to look at it. But these are the types of concerns, maybe unintended consequences, because this is really just creating one mechanism under which someone would file a provisional ballot, which is that they didn't meet the requirement of showing that their photo ID yet, but it maybe doesn't, it inadvertently eliminates an option for somebody who is mistaken about where they're registered. You fill out a provisional ballot, you still have to be registered. They'd have to, check and actually confirm. You'd fill out the form, the provisional ballot and the envelope and everything, and they would still check on that. This seems to say that you wouldn't even be offered a provisional ballot unless you are on the voter rolls at that particular precinct. And as we all know, any one of us who is I think almost all of us have campaigned and run for office here. I think actually there's a few of us who were appointed, but you'll find out soon enough. But informing people, people have misunderstandings about when election day is, how long the polls are open, where they can vote, what the methods are. And so making sure that we are not erecting unintentional hurdles to voting, thank you, Mr. President, is really important, and why this is really very important that we be deliberative and thoughtful about what rules and regulations we're putting in place, because the voters did approve the constitutional amendment, and we are charged with implementing that in the way that it states in the Constitution, but we need to do it in a thoughtful and effective way. So I appreciate the work of the committee. I appreciate the conversation that everybody's having today. I'm going to continue to sit here and read everything I've been provided and see what other questions I can come up with, and other ones that maybe people can answer for me as we go along. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senator Raybold has guests in the North Balcony, 64th graders from Everett Elementary in Lincoln. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator McKinney, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I really don't know where I'm at with this either. Because voter ID and the history of voter ID laws have disproportionately affected my community. And, we could start at the beginning. When the U.S. Constitution was ratified, there was no such thing as voter registration. No registered voters cast a ballot for George Washington or John Adams. The concept did not exist. When voter lists did arrive at the beginning of the 19th century, they were mostly limited to New England, and adding eligible names to rolls was the government's responsibility. Yet even these unobtrusive attempts at registration proved controversial. That controversy came to a head in 1831 in Boston, when a man named Josiah Capon arrived to vote and discovered he'd mistakenly been left off the list. He sued a local election official and attempted to have Massachusetts' voter registration system overturned. Capon lost. Most importantly, his case set a precedent that lasts to this day. Even when the right to vote is protected, the complicated logistics of voting are up to lawmakers to decide. In practice, this means that long as politicians believe or can plausibly claim to believe that they're protecting the integrity of our elections, they could pass laws making it harder to vote, sadly. Where is it? And my biggest thing is I foresee that although I represent a district that doesn't have the greatest turnout, it probably will continue or be worse with voter ID laws. Because people, I would say from my district, they don't really have faith in the political process for many reasons. And the history of voting hasn't been the best towards communities like North Omaha, not even just in the state of Nebraska, but across the country. So I'll listen to the debate on this and the conversation and listen to what are in the amendments and things like that. But it's going to be interesting because, as Senator Blood stated, when people were going around with these petitions, the petitioners didn't even know what the law or what the petition would actually do. They couldn't give you a great conversation about it at all. And a lot of them weren't from Nebraska. They just were paid to come in and be black faces in a black community and convince black people that voter ID was a good thing. That is literally what they were doing. Standing in front of grocery stores and Walmarts and things like that. And it's interesting where this body is going, where this state is going, and where this country is going. It feels like the work of the civil rights movement and the work of Martin Luther King and others is getting pulled back year after year. and we got to stand up and fight for things that, you know, men and women bled for, walked and marched for. So that is my struggle. I understand that the voters last election voted to do voter ID, and we have to craft something that works, I guess, but it's still hard to sit and think about it, honestly, because when you look at the data,
1 minute.
there's not, if any, election fraud in our state or across the country. It's not really found. I mean, you might find a case or two there, here or there, but fraud is not the reason why people are getting elected into office. I would say it's money. So with that, I'll listen, and, you know, I'll probably get back on here and talk about it more in depth, but I just wanted to set the tone for the conversation that I'm really not in favor of voter ID laws because of the historical context in which they've been implemented throughout the history of this nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator McKinney. Senator Raybold, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, maybe a little bit of background in what the Government Affairs Committee had to deal with. I also want to say that this is not just a Secretary of State or the Attorney General's bill. It really is a bill from the Government Affairs Committee. We have, and you know, if you all remember, I was reading letters from physicians. I have letters from the county clerks, the election commissioners, because they really took a deep dive in and dissected all the amendments that were in the legislative bills that were presented to us. But here's some of the issues that we had to face, and I don't know if everybody realizes this or not, but 11 counties out of our 93 counties in Nebraska conduct all mail elections, only by mail. And that's like Boone, Cedar, Cherry, Clay, Dawes, Dixon, Garden, Knox, Merrick, Morrill, and Stanton. There are 8 more counties that conduct some of the precincts in that county vote exclusively by mail. Cumming, Hamilton, Harlan, Nance, Phelps, Richardson, Thayer, and Wayne. And some of the reasons why they do it by mail, it's more cost effective. It's hard to find poll workers. The distance that a voter would have to travel to get to the closest polling plate would be extraordinary. And what we've learned in our state of Nebraska, counties that use all mail elections have the highest turnout rates. So it's no surprise. We heard from so many senior citizens who are still living at home, senior citizens in nursing facilities. I'm just going to read one really quick short letter that I thought was really so cute. She says, I'm Lois McDaniel, and I'm 105 years old. I would like to continue to be able to vote via the mail. I have to use a wheelchair, and I have trouble hearing and seeing. Also, weather is difficult for me as I can't stand the cold, making it hard to get out and about. A paper ballot is easier for me to be able to get at my own, or to go at my own pace and use my visual assistance. So we had to really craft a voter ID bill that wouldn't disenfranchise all those counties that are already voting by mail, disenfranchise some of the best voters, as we all know, are our senior citizens. We didn't want to disenfranchise them. We didn't want to disenfranchise those seniors in nursing homes or assisted living facility. We wanted to make sure that they had full access to being able to exercise their voting rights. So we were juggling with a lot of these concerns expressed by so many different people. But the only way we could get to where we're at is because of the input from the county clerks and the election commissioners, because they're the ones that are going to be in the field being able to execute it. And they came up with so many suggestions on how to make it better. We, in turn, took those suggestions. We bounced it off the Secretary of State. But more importantly, we work with the Attorney General to make sure that we are not violating anyone's rights or the national voter ID requirements. and to make sure that everybody did have that opportunity to vote. And I could spend a lot of time reading some of the great letters that all the clerks sent to me, and I asked questions about, what about college students? What type of ID do they have to show? And they said the reason why they liked our proposal that came out of the committee for students, college students, is because, it didn't have to have their address.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President, which was so important to make sure that we don't disenfranchise college students who are not the best at registering to vote and are not the best at, they're hopping around from different location to different location. So that's a voting group that we didn't want to disenfranchise, and to try to make sure that it was free, fair, and accessible for everyone was a challenge. But the good news is we had input from so many groups to make this better, to give us good guidance. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Raybold. Senator Jacobson, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this morning in opposed to the floor amendment motion 613, and I too am somewhat undecided at this point how I'm going to vote on the amendments going into LB 514. I, like so many others in this body, have a great deal of respect for Senator Brewer and for Senator Slama. If you were going to pick the two people not to get between, those would be my top picks. So both are tough people that feel very, very strongly about what they believe in. And so I'm digging through the pieces of this and trying to figure out just where I want to end up on this issue. I will tell you that the voters have decided. They sent a very clear message what they wanted. So arguing against voter ID, which I tend to agree with the voters, I voted for voter ID, think it's important. And now it's a matter of the legislature doing their responsibility of carrying that out. And so I'm going to work through the pieces to figure out exactly where I want to be on the amendment. The other reason I wanted to rise is I did want to address, there was a lot of discussion over the weekend by so many people about what happened here last week. And what I want to make clear to people that are listening and watching and wondering how this group of 49 people interact with each other on a regular basis, it's probably important to put some of this into context. Every one of us are down here because we do feel strongly about various issues. We are advocates for our constituents, and we're going to express that on the floor. But I can tell you that there are some really good people in this body, and that was evident Friday. And I want you to know that on Friday, as contentious as that debate was, as contentious as that vote was, we saw the best come out in those here on the floor. And what I mean by that is many people realized that Senator Slama was very ill on Friday and should not have been here. In fact, I'm also going to add she should not be here today, but that's a side note. But she was very passionate about being here then and being here today. And sitting right in front of me, it was clear that she was not feeling well. The TV cameras and the cameras are over on the left side. So several of us decided it was appropriate to get up and shield her, the view that they would have of her, and not have that out on TV. So what happened is Senator Frederickson, Senator DeBoer, Senator Kauth, Senator Blood, all were involved in helping shield that view so that Senator Slama could have some protection. That happened on Friday. That doesn't get reported a lot, but that happened on Friday, and it speaks to the quality of the people that are here in this body and who they are as people. And with that, I promised Senator Slama I would yield her at least 30 seconds, and so I'm guessing I left you a little more than that, so I'll give you the chance for the rebuttal.
Senator Slama, that's 1 minute, 36 seconds.
And thank you so much, Senator Jacobson, and thank you so much to everybody who helped out on Friday. I get that the legislature is a public place and sometimes private battles become public. And everybody I talked to and thanked about this, they said, it's okay, don't mention it. Like, I would do the exact same thing for any one of you. And that's something I take seriously. At the end of the day, the 49 of us might be on different sides of an issue, but we're all on this crazy trip together. And I'm just grateful y'all had my 6. Just a quick note, I've gotten some questions about the witness attestation and notary requirements. First off, witness
1 minute.
attestation, thank you, Mr. President. Any registered voter in Nebraska can verify that a person showed them an ID to sign off on their ballot. Over a dozen states use this system. It's commonly used for like spouses can sign off on each other's, friends, family members, somebody at your coffee shop. It literally doesn't matter. And it's worked well in states like Iowa. Rhode Island actually requires 2 people to sign off and be verified for a valid ID. We also, when it comes to the military, on the notary requirement, so if you don't have access to another registered voter in the state of Nebraska, so say you're deployed, I'm thankful for 10 U.S. Code 1044A, which gives all of our uniformed men and women in the military,
your
whether
time,
reservists, dang it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Brandt, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Brewer and the Government Committee for bringing this bill. Generally, I am against notarizing, particularly on a ballot, and I will use my small town of Plymouth, which is about 400 people. We have one notary in the entire town, and she works at the bank from 9 to 3, Monday through Friday. And in order to get something notarized, if you're a customer of the bank, you get it for free. If you're not a customer of the bank, you have to pay $5. So I'm concerned that if we have any language of requiring a notary in a bill and you have to pay $5, that would be construed as a poll tax. The other situation I have in my district is Thayer County. Thayer County is typical of a small rural county in Nebraska. 1/2 of the county is mail-in ballots and 1/2 of the county has polling places. And this is because to have a polling place, you have to have half the people from one particular party and half the people from another particular party. We can't find enough people from one side that are willing to work the polls. Therefore, those small towns and communities now are required to have mail-in ballots. They really would like to keep their polling places, but it's a public obligation out there. If we want to keep our polling places, people have to step up and be willing to work the polls. So I wonder if Senator Slama would be willing to answer a question.
Senator Slama, would you yield to a question?
Yes, sir.
Senator Slama, in regards to notarization of ballots, is that included in your proposal?
Notarization is included, but it's just one of 2 options voters have. Any Nebraska registered voter can also sign their name attesting that that person showed them a valid ID. So it's one of 2 options, yes.
So what are the consequences if I sign somebody's ballot?
The consequences if you sign somebody's ballot and that proved to be a falsification of that document?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that would fall under our falsification of government document statutes. That would be a felony, which is pretty fair across the board for all other states that have this system.
But how would you prove, it would have to be intentional, would it not?
Yes, and that's why it would be so difficult to prove. You'd have to look at a pattern of behavior. My witness attestation system also uses a back-end audit from the Attorney General's office. So if somebody in just a one-off looks at an ID, says, okay, this looks all right, and they in good faith believed that they were attesting correctly and signed off, they're fine. It's that person who has malicious intent who goes off signing off on 1,000 witness attestation signatures without verifying ballots with invalid photo IDs, those bad operators that will be caught up in the witness attestation system, not the one-off people.
So to be clear, on a mail-in ballot, that individual would have to provide a ID number like my driver's license?
Not under my amendment, no.
The witness would have to provide an ID number?
No.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Slama.
Thank you.
I guess I'm going to listen to the debate today to see where we're going. I think it'll be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Slama and Brandt. Senator John Kavanaugh, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I appreciate colleagues that had a couple folks pull me off to help answer my question that I raised the last time on the mic, which was about provisional ballots. So this is again on AM 1801, talking about, well, I can't find the part I highlighted before, but basically talking about provisional ballots. If a person shows up at their polling location and they don't have an ID, and they can fill out a provisional ballot and then have opportunity to cure. And part of it specifically states that the person has to be registered at that location. And so I was concerned that that would supplant the current provisional ballot protocol, which is where somebody is has moved within the county and they go to the wrong place or something along those lines. But it was clarified to me that there's the separate section that pertains to that opportunity for provisional ballot where somebody shows up and is at the wrong polling location, it would still be in effect. And so I asked, obviously, if you show up and you're at the wrong location and you don't have an ID, that you would then still be able to do a provisional ballot on both grounds. And then, of course, the ballot wouldn't be accepted until the individual voter who filled out the provisional ballot had cured at least the ID portion, meaning that they had shown up. Let's see, I found it here, section 10, which is page 11, and says the voter, they have to fill out the form stating all of these things, their name, that they're registered voter at, put their address, that they didn't provide photographic identification as required by law, or I have a reasonable impediment, and then they have up to 7 days to come to the election commissioner to cure, meaning that they can show their ID or provide the attestation that they do not have to fill out a ID, which includes or do not have to have an ID, which includes things like a religious objection, so I appreciate that and that thoughtfulness of this amendment. And I would point out, so there is a portion about the religious objection, so a person can, this is subsection 11, where the Secretary of State shall provide a standard certification about a person's impediment and what their applicable impediment is. And so there's inability to obtain a photographic identification due to disability or illness, or lack of birth certificate or other required documents, or religious objection. And then under section 12, a voter's religious objection to being photographed may inform the election commissioner or county clerk of the county in which the voter resides of such objection in writing prior to the election. If the election commissioner or county clerk receives written notice no later than 6 p.m. on the second Friday preceding the election, the election commissioner or county clerk shall place a notation on the precinct list of a registered voter for a polling location that the voter has a religious objection to being photographed. And then it goes on to state that objection shall then be noted going forward in subsequent elections. So a person has to do that the one time, and then it would continue on. But I guess my concern about that particular objection is that somebody who, like I said before, we've all spent a lot of time trying to inform voters about time, location, methods of voting when you're in the middle of a campaign, and it is a lot of one-on-one conversations with people explaining their specific situation about voting. And I would be concerned about somebody not meeting the deadline for that, getting that objection noted. And so I guess I wonder if that would be part of the curing process for a provisional ballot. Somebody shows up without an ID and it's not noted in there. That then they could, thank you, Mr. President, if it's not noted in the voter roll that they have a religious objection to an ID, if they'd be able to vote a provisional ballot, and then they'd have to then provide the attestation as to their religious exception through the form within the 7 days to make sure that their provisional ballot is counted. I think that's how those two sections would read together. Not 100% certain, because like I said, I'm still sort of reading this on the fly here, but I do appreciate getting answers to people who are listening and explaining this to me as we go. But like I said, I'm still working my way through it to see where I stand on this amendment and any other potential amendments as they pertain to this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Senators Reapy and Kaup have some guests in the north balcony. 75 students from Millard Central and Anderson Middle School in Omaha. Please stand and be recognized by your Nebraska Legislature. Senator Dorn, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for the conversation this morning and the discussion on this bill, this very important bill that we have before us today. I was wondering if Senator Brewer would yield to a question. Okay.
Senator Brewer, would you yield to a question?
Yes.
Yes. Senator Brewer, a lot of discussion on the two amendments, but want to do some assuming here for a little bit. If this bill would pass this year, when would this take effect? For what election?
Well, the intent is that if we can pass this here at the end of the session, that then this would be in place and available to use for the 2024 election.
Okay. So in our next, I call it basically statewide election, but suppose someone, right now we're all registered voters. We just show up to polls and vote. What will they have to show if your amendment passes? What will they have to do when they go to vote that's different than right now, the first time?
Well, right now, there isn't that requirement, but what they would be required to do is to provide an ID, and the bill kind of specifies what that ID needs to be as far as the options, but of course the primary would be your DMV driver's license.
Driver's license. What about a mail-in ballot? If people are used to, in any county, used to mail-in or even wherever they are, what do they have to do to get, to comply with the law then for a mail-in ballot?
Good question. So everyone kind of understands, which is kind of a fundamental difference here is one, you would be putting that ID number on there, and then that is going to correlate to a database that they can go to find the picture and your name. Okay. The exception, of course, is that we have in there for those that are, say, in a senior home or assisted living, because of the situation where they have to have their information already in a database for that facility, then you can do essentially a group verification on individuals and save each individual from having to go through that process.
So the nursing home could do a kind of with the county election clerk, they could do a group thing for that?
It's an internal photo ID that the facility has that then they can share, so that way it takes less burden upon the senior citizens in order to go through the voting process.
Okay, because, thank you, Senator Burr. One of the things that I've had while I call it the government committee and everybody else has been working on this with Senator Slama's, probably the most emails I've gotten about the voter ID bill is what happens in a nursing home? How do we make sure that those people yet still have a process whereby it doesn't stop them from getting the ability to vote? Because one thing that is very important, I call it generally to our senior population, is the right to vote. As we look at many of the elections and as you visit with people, especially when you're running and knocking door to door, the more senior they are or whatever, they have a very, very strong record of voting. And that's something that comes with them over time and the ability to want to vote and their interest in what all goes on. Sometimes some of the...
1 minute.
Thank you very much. Sometimes some of the younger ones don't vote as much, and then as they go through life, then they pick that more up. But very interesting to listen to some of the comments today, some of the discussion going on, and thank you for the debate.
Thank you, Senators. Senator Albright, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to yield my time to Senator Slama.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Salami, you have 4 minutes, 52 seconds.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you very much, Senator Albright. I promise I'm not trying to block discussion of the amendment itself. I'm just trying to build up a record before I end up not feeling well, which I absolutely will at some point today. We're well on our way there. So I just wanted to hit on a few of the questions raised about witness attestation and notary. So my big problem in this section of the Evnen Amendment is that there is no verification of mail-in IDs. So right now it's a system in this amendment that says you either give a copy of your ID or you give your ID number. The problem is that their list of acceptable IDs are so expansive that there's literally no way to verify that that ID number is legitimate, because you're saying any political subdivision can issue these IDs. There's no set system in place that requires a coordinated numbering system to verify that that person's a registered voter, that they're a citizen. And there's also no sharing of that information besides the DMV motor voter program. So we've got witness attestation on one side of my proposal, and that's any registered Nebraska voter. Any registered Nebraska voter. It could be your spouse, your friend at your coffee shop, like whatever. If you don't have access to that, like if you're an out-of-state voter, or you're in the military, and I'm grateful to Senator Bosselman for raising this point because it gives me the chance to nerd out on a U.S. code. If you're in the military, a really cool part of our code is 10 U.S. Code 1044A, which actually says that as a military notary, any uniformed service member, whether they're reservist or active duty, can serve as a notary, and states are required to recognize those military notary services just the same as they do any other notary public. So I'm referencing 10 U.S. Code 1044A, say our military members would be fined. I'm really grateful to Senator Dorn for bringing up seniors in nursing homes, because that is a big step in the right direction. I think both sides of us, both sides of whether you're talking the Evnen Amendment or my own amendment, we had a great communication, great dialogue with the nursing homes about what could work to give our seniors access to voting, because so many of our seniors have served our country and fought for that right to vote, and they should have just as much ability as anyone to get out and vote. So that's why we crafted nursing home IDs. As Senator Brewer noted, that Medicare or Medicaid ID with a photo. We also included expired licenses in that. A lot of our seniors have expired licenses. Witness attestation is also very easy to fulfill if you are in a nursing home surrounded by other Nebraska voters that are registered to vote. But there is this really cool program that some of our counties do where they actually send election officials to the nursing homes and have them vote. And it's not mail-in voting, it's not absentee voting, it's like actual considered to be in-person voting. So that's where not only do we have access, we have an extra layer of access for our senior citizens, and that's something that I've really focused on and fought to include. The biggest difference when it comes to the student IDs, which I'm grateful Senator Raybould brought up student IDs in the discussion we had, is it gets back to my first point about verifying these IDs. Thank you, Mr. President. The big difference between the Evnen Amendment and my own amendment is that there is no requirement for these political entities to share citizenship data or verification data with the Secretary of State's office to verify these IDs. So we do include student IDs in my bill, but only if the higher education institution opts into the citizenship checks and shares their information, like those number systems of how you can verify how that is a valid ID. Those data points all go to the Secretary of State's office. Most other states that use valid student IDs have this opt-in process, and it's simply so you can verify it to add that additional layer of security to your votes. So it's really a common sense extra layer of security for our elections. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Bostelman, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm only going to have a comment on Senator Slama's, what she just stated about any military member may be a notary. That may be what statute says, but that's not practicality and that's not reality. Nothing negative against what Senator Slama has to say. It's that you have to be specifically billeted or placed into a position to where you can receive a notary, and that has to be authorized. And there's certain things that you must do. So not anyone or everyone in the military will have that ability to be a notary. Only certain positions and certain people in the military do have that authorization in order to be a notary, a federal notary. Those are usually kept within the JAG department or within a command structure itself, very specific to that, and there's not a great deal of those. Well, you can have civilian notaries, people who do pay for that and do that on their own that have civilian notaries. We would have those in our offices, but usually there's very narrow number of people that have those on any installation. So again, it's just one of those things to think through. It's one of those things that need to be considered as people deploy around the world and then get redeployed around the world. You don't always have that opportunity to have that notary position in place to be able to do those documents. I don't think that it would be a large number, but that risk or that opportunity or that situation could very well arise. So again, it's not that everyone is a notary, or maybe they could be by statute, but practicality, that doesn't happen. Function within the military, that doesn't happen. It's certain people within the military in certain positions will have that notary authority, or if the military member doesn't, then within that office or that directorate, there may be a civilian that's sitting there that has that notary authority. That I just want to provide that back for the record. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Bostoman. Seeing no one else in the queue, Senator Kavanaugh, you're recognized to close on your motion. Senator Conrad has been authorized to close on her behalf. Senator Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I think we've had a very thoughtful introductory debate and deliberation in regards to one of the issues of paramount importance for the Nebraska Legislature in this session, and that includes carrying out the will of the voters as expressed at the ballot box in regards to the constitutional amendment to impose voter restrictions that was put before the citizenry in November 2022. So as you've heard from our adept and able chair, the government committee has been working very, very hard, as has our friend Senator Slama, to figure out how to really put in place a measure that honors the will of the people. And to be clear, those voting rights groups and civic engagement groups that have been monitoring these processes have not changed their position, nor have those members that oppose voter ID. I will be clear, I voted against the voter ID measure at the ballot box, and I've worked against similar measures in the legislature for, I think, about a decade, because I see them as unnecessary and costly and needlessly risking the fundamental right to vote for too many, particularly in the absence of fraud or other compelling government interest, as is the case in Nebraska and across the country. That being said, I think that we all want to take to heart our duty to uphold the Constitution. And if that includes implementation of a measure that even we vehemently disagree with, that is part of our duty. That is part of our duty. And so we have to figure out a thoughtful way to give expression to what the voters asked us to do. So I've already spent some time reminding the body exactly how narrow the measure was that was put to Nebraska voters. I've already talked a little bit about the boundaries that exist in terms of constitutional law on the federal and state level, statutory law on the federal and state level, and corresponding relevant court decisions that show us the path when it comes to implementing voter ID measures that we need to take. to ensure that the voters' rights is upheld and to ensure that we do not spark costly, lengthy civil rights litigation. So let me also take a step back here and provide members with a little bit more context. And I'll be happy to track down the specific statistic from the Secretary of State's office and the election officials who weighed in on these measures to the government committee. But as I understand it, well north of 90% of eligible voters in Nebraska, maybe even up to 95% or higher than that, are going to have access to a standard driver's license or a state ID or other forms of acceptable photographic identification as is contemplated in these various measures. So the real question before us is then, how do we ensure a safety net for a small percentage of voters that aren't going to have access to these traditional forms of identification to effectuate their right to vote? So that's kind of where the devil's in the details, I guess, would be one way of explaining it, and perhaps helps to illuminate the different policy options before Senator Brewer's amendment and Senator Slama's amendment. And I think that what we looked at carefully in the government committee was ensuring that that safety net, that catch-all for that very small percentage of voters that aren't going to have access to that traditional ID really meets best practices. So there's really, I think, no disagreement amongst the parties that there is a small subset of eligible voters that may have religious objections to the prohibition against graven images. So they may not have access to a photo identification. Actually, that case is thank you, Mr. President, an old ACLU case that emanates from Nebraska and went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. So that's one component which I think there's a fair amount of agreement on. And I know that we're running out of time here. So, Mr. President, I'll go ahead and withdraw this motion.
It is withdrawn. Mr. Clerk.
In that case, Mr. President, Senator Michaela Cavanaugh would move to bracket Legislative Bill 514 until June 1st, 2023. I understand Senator Conrad's authorized to open on this motion.
Senator Conrad, you're recognized to open.
Thank you, Mr. President. And just timing wise, it seemed like a better way to continue some of my thoughts in regards to this measure. So I would ask members ultimately to vote against this motion. It was filed as Senator Kavanaugh Hunt and I moved procedurally to structure debate in the wake of the rules change that was effectuated without a public hearing earlier this year. And that's why this measure is on the board. So again, there's a very small percentage of Nebraskans who may have deeply held religious beliefs that look at the prohibition against graven images as something that would prohibit them from securing a photo on their driver's license, what have you. So there's a curing provision. There's an opportunity in these implementation measures to recognize that important First Amendment concern for those with deeply held, sincerely held religious objections. There's also, I think, a recognition and an understanding of perhaps just some practical matters that happen in the course of our daily life where people who do have access to traditional forms of ID like a driver's license or a state identification card may accidentally lose it leading up to Election Day. And so trying to figure out for those kinds of instances how we can have a curing process for people who accidentally misplaced or lost their driver's license to ensure that their right to vote is not hindered. So that's another area that we've looked at. We also recognize and understand that some people will not be able to afford identification documents or other forms of vital statistics in order to access a driver's license or a state ID, so that there is a recognition that we need to provide access to those documents for those who cannot afford them. So in order to not institute what would be effectively a poll tax. So we have to also have an opportunity for financial resources and support so that people who are unable to afford the identification are not unnecessarily denied a right to vote. We also have to recognize and understand that there's a set of Nebraska voters who are not in Nebraska during the early voting period or on election day. Of course, our military voters, our overseas voters, and some students who may be at a campus out of state. So one thing that I think is really important to note in this regard, and Senator Slama talked about this a little bit, so I just want to make sure to provide some clarity. I understand that she was looking at a model from our sister state in Wisconsin in regards to the attestation provisions. So she did a great job of laying out how this might work for our military members overseas, but it didn't take into account a couple of things, and I think that is distinguishable and want to note that for the record. The Wisconsin model does not require the witness to be a registered Wisconsin voter. That is an opposite approach to what Senator Slama's approach is, which would require that the attestation provision is a registered Nebraska voter. So think about this from a practical perspective, colleagues. If you're a Nebraskan who's registered to vote in Nebraska and you're attending college out of state, it may not be feasible for you to identify or access a registered Nebraska voter out of state to give you an attestation to ensure that you can participate in your right to vote and have your vote be counted. So that's one area that I just lift up by way of example about how we can and should utilize models from other states that have implemented voter ID measures, but we also have to learn from those models as we adopt our own to make sure that we don't create legal, policy, or practical barriers that would infringe upon an otherwise eligible Nebraskan's right to vote. And I think that's something that's also important to remember. Our Secretary of State, our election commissioners across the state, our poll workers across the state take their duty seriously. And we need to do the same. We need to divorce this dialogue and this debate from politics and from personalities. We need to keep it focused on policy. And the election commissioners and the Secretary of State who are charged with implementing these measures have brought forward technical information about how we can best ensure that we facilitate the will of the voters and ensure that hardworking election officials and poll workers can do their job without chaos or confusion. So we look at the playbook from other states. It tells us this is not going to be a problem for the vast majority of voters. However, for folks that are going to face some barriers, we need to figure out some solutions proactively together for how to address voters who have religious objections, voters who are out of state due to military service or otherwise, students, those who lack IDs, those who lack resources to secure IDs, and those that perhaps misplace or lose their ID accidentally prior to the voting period. So taking into account all of these different models and the existing legal framework, I believe that the Brewer Amendment does the best job possible to ensure that we are not otherwise infringing upon an eligible person's right to vote. And I think Senator Slama, myself, Senator Brewer, every single member of this body wants to ensure that eligible voters have the right to vote. There's no disagreement there. And it's also important to remember that we have a host of safeguards in place and significant penalties as well when ineligible voters attempt to vote. We have criminal penalties. We have list maintenance activities that happen. These matters are already governed outside of the measure before you. So you can rest easy in understanding and knowing that if you're concerned about ineligible voters voting, that is already governed by other aspects of law, and it already carries significant penalties with it, as it should. Because we all can agree that ineligible voters should not be voting, but we must also agree that eligible voters should be afforded the right to vote. So I think that's best expressed through Senator Brewer's amendment, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. And thanks Senator Brewer and Senator Slama for their thoughtful approach to this important debate. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Mr. Clerk.
Mr. President, I inadvertently did not read the title. Legislative Bill 514, introduced by Senator Brewer. It's a bill for an act relating to elections, amends several sections within Chapter 16, 18, and 32. Changes a provision relating to the remote petition, changes provisions relating to the Municipal Initiative and Referendum Act, defines the term, changes provision under the Election Act relating to voter registration duties of political subdivisions, candidate filings, name changes, petitions, notices, ballots, secure ballot drop boxes, recall procedures, initiatives, and referendums, and electioneering, provides a penalty for false swearing, harmonized provisions, repeals the original section. Bill is read for the first time on January 17th of this year and referred to the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. That committee placed the bill on general file with committee amendments. Mr. President, pending is still the Michaela Cavanaugh bracket motion.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. Senator Slama, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President, and good morning again, colleagues. I am grateful that Senator Conrad hit on some of those limitations outlined to us by the Supreme Court. The religious objection to being photographed, lost ID, not in Nebraska, money. Those are all key elements that we considered in our own amendment and address differently than the Evnen amendment. So I think it's critical that we do outline those and the constitutional problems that I have with the Evnen amendment on those fronts. If you look at my AM 1833, section 7 on page 9, questions have been raised about fees that might be paid as being a poll tax. We've got that covered. If you read that section, the Secretary of State shall be responsible for the payment of all administrative fees associated with procuring the documentation necessary to obtain a state identification card. We also have other lines in this amendment that specifically cover not only costs to voters, ensuring they have no costs, but ensuring that there are no unfunded mandates on our counties. I love fighting unfunded mandates, and the last thing I wanted voter ID to be was an unfunded mandate on our county. So we are very explicit in that the Secretary of State or the state cover all of these costs related to voter ID. And it's just so important we be thoughtful on that front to not put this cost on our counties. Now, I'm going to be clear again. I'm going to ask that you vote against cloture as the Evnen amendment gets attached to this bill. LB 514 is our elections omnibus bill. It's a non-controversial bill we should pass. However, the voter ID amendment that's going to be attached to it is the Evnen amendment as introduced by Colonel Brewer, who I have all the love and the respect in the world for. I wholeheartedly believe it's unconstitutional. I'll be taking more time on the mic this time around to get through my document with my constitutional concerns, but I'm asking for three main things. Like, I'm not hiding the ball here. I'm not moving my negotiations. One, we need citizenship checks covering 100% of the voter rolls. Right now, the only thing the Secretary of State is explicitly authorized to check in the Evnen Amendment is the DMV motor voter registration data. Now, that's entirely different from those who just happen to have a license. It covers only about 55% of voters rather than the 95% that have a valid driver's license right now. We're talking about two different sheets of music here. Two, we have to have some way of verifying mail-in voting, mail-in ballots. The language of the constitutional amendment makes it clear, like, voters include mail-in voters. Like, they are equal. They're equal in the eyes of the law. We need to treat them equally in the eyes of the law. My system for verification uses what other states have done, which is a combination of witness attestation and or notarization. Whatever a person has more access to, they can use at no cost to them. Third, we have to remove the reasonable impediment language. It goes so far beyond the language of the constitutional amendment. It's voter ID without the voter ID. It means any voter can come in and check one of at least 3 boxes that we outlined. If you look at that reasonable impediment language in the Evnen Amendment, it says shall include, and then 3 different reasons that you just check a box for. But it can also include a box that has any other reason on it. It sets the floor. It doesn't set the ceiling for what can be asked. It sets the bare minimum of what can be asked. So this needs to change because it's voter ID without the voter ID. And I'm going to get more into each of these 3 changes that I need to see happen. But otherwise, I'm telling you right now, if you choose the easy way out and to just go ahead and vote for cloture, and you can feel free to, like, I'm not.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not going to hold you to it. This is not anything personal. This is entirely based in policy. But look at who is leading this debate on the Evnen Amendment. It's those who have traditionally opposed voter ID. And I'm the person who literally helped lead the charge on getting voter ID across the finish line. I'm saying the Evnen Amendment is unconstitutional. I'm asking you stand with me on that. Otherwise, we are going to be here in a special session, and I'm the last person on the floor who wants that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Slama, you're recognized to speak.
Outstanding. Thank you very much, Mr. President. So I'm going to get back into my document here with all the constitutional issues of the Evnen Amendment. I am going to turn my light back on again. But I've already covered Section 5, which is that this Evnen Amendment violates the National Voter Registration Act. It goes beyond the limitations that the National Voter Registration Act puts in place for how a registered voter can be removed from the rolls. It removes their due process. My amendment takes the legal approach to doing that. I'd encourage the committee amendment to be amended with my language towards that end in the bill. Sections 10 and 11 place an undue burden on the fundamental right to vote. Sections 10 and 11 of Secretary Evnen's amendment is unconstitutional because the affidavit required is confusing and ambiguous. Again, this isn't just like a subjective wording that I'm throwing from the sky. There's literally a case on point. Noting confusing and ambiguous language and couldn't even pass a rational basis review, which again, anybody who's even a novice in this could tell you that's like really impressive. Under both the United States Constitution and the Nebraska State Constitution, voting has been found to be a fundamental right. Burdens on the fundamental right are subject to 2 different levels of scrutiny depending on the burden imposed. The level of review relevant here is rational basis review. And I'm not just pulling this out of the sky. Voter ID is one of the most litigated subjects short of like abortion and gun rights. So everything I've done in my amendment and my analysis of this has been analyzing case law, analyzing what other states do, and analyzing what the courts have said we can do in crafting this language. So in the case that I'm talking about with sections 10 and 11, that's directly on point. The Missouri Supreme Court found that a confusing and ambiguous affidavit failed rational basis review and was therefore unconstitutional. The Evnen AM on the affidavit says that a voter who has a reasonable impediment to voting does not have to show an ID, but it does not define what reasonable impediment is. The voter has to fill out an affidavit claiming a reasonable impediment. The affidavit restricts the voter to 3 possible reasonable impediments, but a voter may legitimately believe that their circumstances qualify as a reasonable impediment under the amendment language, but is not listed on the affidavit. If the amendment wanted to limit reasonable impediments to those listed on the affidavit, it should say so both in the text of the amendment and on the affidavit. Because it does not, the affidavit is ambiguous and confusing to the voter. Under the logic of the Missouri Supreme Court, then it fails rational basis review. While the Missouri Supreme Court case is not controlling, a Nebraska court or a federal court would analyze the amendment under that same standard. Therefore, we can be confident that this amendment places an undue burden on the fundamental right to vote under both the United States Constitution and Article 122 of the Nebraska Constitution. Section 10 and associated sections of Secretary Evnen's amendment violates Article 1, Section 22 of the Nebraska Constitution by failing to actually implement the voter ID provisions required required by that article. And it's important we get to that language. So the language of the actual amendment approved in Initiative 432 by voters in November 2022 is, before casting a ballot in any election, a qualified voter shall present valid photographic identification in a manner specified by the legislature to ensure the preservation of an individual's rights under this Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. It requires the legislature to pass a law that says how somebody shows an ID, not whether they show an ID. The courts have been so clear in what your exceptions need to be when it comes to voter ID. If we go beyond that with the reasonable impediment language, we're running directly afoul of, thank you, Mr. President, the constitutional amendment language. At the same time, hierarchy of laws demand that this provision passed by the voters be interpreted as consistent with the U.S. Constitution. And I'm going to talk about Crawford versus Marion County Election Board that's relevant here on my next turn at the mic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. You're next in the queue. And this is your third time on that bracket motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. And if anybody has any questions whatsoever, feel free to ask me on the mic. I love nerding out on voter ID. This is something that over the last few years, I've learned a lot of different aspects of. My own amendment is crafted in a way that's thoughtful. It doesn't reinvent the wheel. And the objections that I'm raising here are extremely legitimate. So I'm asking for 3 changes to the Evnen Amendment. 3 changes, 3 basic changes. I'm not hiding the ball at all here. I'm trying to prevent a court case where this gets taken up and we're stuck in a special session because the courts laughed our bill out of the room. Okay, so back to my constitutional objections with Section 10 and 11. In Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, the United States Supreme Court found that under the United States Constitution, there are only select groups of individuals that may receive special accommodations under voter ID laws. So again, this language doesn't say the legislature shall prescribe whether we can show an ID in a strict voter ID state. It says how somebody can present that ID, and this Crawford versus Marion language is very relevant. They include elderly persons born out of state who may have difficulty obtaining a birth certificate, persons who, because of economic or other personal limitations, may find it difficult either to secure a copy of their birth certificate or to assemble the other required documentation to obtain a state-issued identification, homeless persons, and persons with a religious objection to being photographed. Taken with the Nebraska Constitutional Amendment, what this means is that the Nebraska Legislature must pass a law implementing voter ID that only 1, makes an exception for those with a religious objection, and 2, makes accommodations for all other groups outlined by the Supreme Court. If we cannot make accommodations for those groups, then they too would be exempt. However, the text of the constitutional amendment requires that anybody outside of these groups must show a valid ID, which is where we fall on that reasonable impediment language because it's overly inclusive. Evnen AM Section 10 and related sections go far beyond this by allowing somebody to vote if they're sick or don't have a birth certificate. The last category is very concerning because the United States Supreme Court has explicitly said that having to go acquire the appropriate documentations to get an ID is not an undue burden on the right to vote. Therefore, the Evnen AM violates the Nebraska Constitution and betrays the will of the voter that everyone show an ID in order to vote. My amendment, on the other hand, makes accommodations for all of these groups while requiring an ID for those who are not included. The Secretary of State is to aid these individuals in obtaining the necessary documents to get an ID. If they cannot, the Secretary of State can provide them an exemption and provide an ID for them. Now, you might have a question of, well, when we see an influx of people looking for the documentation necessary to get an ID, how many people is that going to take? Well, we have the same language that Missouri uses, and in working with the Missouri government, I found out that they have 1 person that's able to handle all of the documentation requests that come in their office's way. As you know, Missouri is larger than the state of Nebraska, so I'm confident that 1 FTE could be able to handle this. Section 12 of the Evnen Amendment, it violates the religious objector's fundamental right to vote as outlined by the U.S. Supreme Court. Any infringement upon a person's sincerely held religious belief is analyzed under strict scrutiny. requiring those who have religious beliefs against being photographed to recertify that religious belief would be a burden analyzed under strict scrutiny.
One
And it
minute.
is, thank you, Mr. President, and it is not the least restrictive means of achieving that. A voter could simply be required to notify the secretary if their belief changes. Therefore, the recertification would fail strict scrutiny and be an unconstitutional right on the right to vote. So section 12 says that during every election cycle, a person with a religious objection to being photographed would have to recertify that with their county clerk. Not only does this create more work for our county election officials, it also puts an undue burden on a person exercising a valid religious objection in violating their fundamental right to vote. And I'll keep going on section 17 to section 19 on my next turn on the mic. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was going to yield Senator Slama the time. I will yield my time to Senator Slama.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Slama, you have 4 minutes and 50 seconds.
Y'all are being really too kind. I appreciate it. Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh. Thank you, Mr. President. So going on, I swear I'm on like the last front back page with my constitutional objections to the Evnen Amendment, but I'm building a record here. I'm building a record, one, that everybody was able to hear these constitutional objections, and two, that they were noted on the floor of the legislature during our discussions. You can take them or leave them. Again, I'm asking for those 3 changes to be made to the Evnen Amendment, and I'll back off. I might even vote for the thing. So back to sections 17 through section 19 of the Evnen Amendment. So this either violates the fundamental right to vote or violates the Equal Protection Clause as articulated by the United States Supreme Court. So we have case law directly on point. It also violates an amendment passed by voters allowing non-exempt, as defined by the United States Supreme Court, persons to vote without showing a valid ID. So if you look at sections 17 through 19, there are 2 possible interpretations. On one hand, one interpretation is that no one's going to check to see if a voter actually had a reasonable impediment to vote, thus not actually requiring anybody to show an ID. So all a voter would have to do is say, I have a reasonable impediment to vote, check a box, and you're good to go. So that's interpretation 1. So as we've already discussed in my objections to sections 10 and 11, this would not only fly in the face of the voters who approve the constitutional amendment, it would fly in the face of the voters and violate the plain language of the constitutional amendment. So on the other hand, the other interpretation would be that the election officials in each county would be left to interpret and verify whether an individual has a reasonable impediment to obtaining an ID in order to vote. So with the fact that Nebraska has 93 counties, at a minimum, 93 different election officials would be making separate determinations of whether a reasonable impediment existed. An election commissioner in Scottsbluff County might interpret somebody's cold as a reasonable impediment, while an official in Otoe County might say that it's not. Such a possibility would violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment as outlined in Bush v. Gore. In other words, if this is the correct interpretation and people's reasonable impediments have to be checked, this amendment will turn all of our elections into the fiasco that was Florida in the 2000 presidential election. I was only 4 at the time, but I've read a lot about it. It didn't seem like a good time for anybody involved. However, it doesn't just stop there. Since sections 17 through 19, when looked at a whole, require 3 different election entities, the election official, the receiving board, and the counting board, to make potentially separate decisions on an individual's reasonable impediment, there's a possibility that we would have 279 different interpretations of whether a certain claimed reasonable impediment counts. So just to summarize, on one hand, when you're talking reasonable impediment, it's either everybody has one, or we're going to have 279 different standards, and you run into a Bush v. Gore problem. Both run into constitutional issues, and it's important to get those objections on the mic. I've outlined that we can tighten this up by using the language used in my own amendment that simply keeps the groups of those who don't have to show IDs limited to what the courts have said we have to include. So section 23, taken with the rest of the Evnen Amendment, section 23 violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. The United States Supreme Court has held that a state cannot discriminate against a person based on where they're from as it relates to exercising a constitutionally protected right. Voting, as I've already stated, thank you, Mr. President. Voting, as I've already stated, is a constitutionally protected right. Evans Amendment only pays for documents required to get IDs for people born in Nebraska. Let me repeat that. Evans Amendment only pays for the documents required to get IDs for people born in the state of Nebraska. If you're born out of state, it doesn't pay for the documents you need to vote. This is a clear burden on a fundamental right based on the state a person was born in. Thus, Evans Amendment violates the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. That wraps up my constitutional concerns. I'm happy to answer anybody's questions if they have them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to speak, and this is your last time before your close.
Thank you, Mr. President. I did have a question, actually, because I was listening. So I will ask the question, then ask you to yield to the question. So what Senator Slama was just saying about only those born in Nebraska, and I'm curious if we could amend the amendment that you're talking about to expand it to include by birth Nebraskans, because that does actually take out a large population of people, I would imagine. Would Senator Slama yield to a question?
Senator Slama, would you yield to a question?
Of course.
So could we amend that?
Oh God, we absolutely could. We could address any of the constitutional objections I've noted very easily, and that's what I'm actually asking and encouraging the body to do. So great question.
You have some floor amendments filed?
I have not only floor amendments, but also amendments with my own amendment on them. I'm also happy to negotiate if somebody wants to get around a table with me and cuss and discuss the Evans Amendment with the amendments that I've recommended be added to it.
This might surprise you, but I haven't paid as close of attention to this bill as some others. And so I am sitting here listening and learning and having some very serious binder envy right now. That's like next level right there on your podium. Would you like any more time, or are you looking for a break?
No, I think I'm good now. I actually do want us to get to the committee amendment and discuss the Brewer amendment. I'm not trying to block it getting added on at all. I just want to get my objections on the record, and I think we're there.
All right, then I will yield the remainder of my time to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, senators. Senator Conrad, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, colleagues. I wanted to provide just a few additional thoughts in regards to some of the case law that governs these matters and some of the broader legal principles that Senator Slama appropriately mentioned. We should absolutely, in this instance and in all instances, be concerned about potential violations of our fundamental right to equal protection when it comes to government action, whether that's distilled in our federal constitution or in our state constitution. But let me take a step back and kind of explain equal protection perhaps in more of a, well, let's call it a law school 101 kind of manner. So at first blush, you would think equal protection means everybody has to be treated equally 100%. That's not quite how it works. So of course we have equality before the law, but recognizing that different groups are not similarly situated, we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to equal protection. And I'm sorry if I'm not explaining this very clearly, but what the courts have said in interpreting these provisions, as has other area of our case law, et cetera, and statutory framework, is that you need to treat people equally and the same if they are similarly situated. You do not have that same sort of lens if the groups or individuals are not similarly situated. So when courts start to look at some of these issues, they may provide appropriate distinctions or distinguishable approaches for different groups of people under the same umbrella. So, for example, we might be looking at in-person voters. We may be looking at mail-in voters. We may be looking at in-person early voters. And the question will really come down to whether or not these groups are similarly situated. And I think just as a practical common sense perspective, it's clear that they are not in terms of the technical aspects and method in terms of how they are casting their vote. So from a broad perspective, we need to treat all eligible voters in an equitable manner. Absolutely, no disagreement. But when it comes to ensuring equal protection for different types of voters in terms of the method in which they cast their vote, that broad equal protection provision doesn't look the same because the voters are not similarly situated. They have a different method to effectuate their fundamental rights. And so when you look at the case law that is specifically on point, and Senator Slama already talked about this, there's really no disagreement as to the controlling case law here. But one of the primary, one of the paramount Supreme Court decisions governing this measure is Crawford versus Marion County Election Board. And this was decided in 2008 by the United States Supreme Court. And it ended up being a plurality opinion, so that's important to note. But what it was really one of the first and most comprehensive looks at how one of our sister states implemented a voter ID provision. And the sister state that they were looking at was Indiana. And what the court found was that the Indiana law that they were looking at, they found that voter ID was permissible. But they also, thank you, Mr. President, they also found that that was because the Indiana law made exceptions for absentee ballots submitted by mail. They made an exception for people who lived and voted in nursing homes and other congregate living facilities. They made exceptions for voters that were indigent. They made exceptions for religious objections. And they had an opportunity for provisional ballots to be cast and for voters to execute an affidavit attesting to some of those reasons why they may not have access to a photographic identification otherwise. So when the court looked at this Indiana law, it said, we're going to uphold this voter ID measure because you have a thoughtful approach to implementation and not a one-size-fits-all. That's what the Brewer Amendment does, and that's what we need to keep in mind. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Conrad. Seeing no one else in the queue, Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, you're recognized to close on your bracket motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I think, as Senator Slama said, let's get on to the next amendments. So well, let's just go to a vote anyways. Why not? It's fun. It's Monday. We haven't voted on it yet. Something of mine yet today. It's almost noon. Let's go bananas. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator. Members, the question is the bracket motion. All those in favor, vote aye. All those opposed, vote nay. Mr. Clerk.
0 ayes, 32 nays on the motion to bracket, Mr. President.
The motion fails. Senator Brewer, you're recognized to open on the committee amendments.
Mr. President, all right, we are now on AM 853. 853 was heard on the second day of February with no opposition in the bill hearing. Committee advanced the bill AM 583 with the amendment on a 6-2 vote. The committee amendment makes several changes to the bill. First, the amendment makes a few tweaks and changes to this bill to clarify information required on certain candidate filing forms, to define how to make changes in certain work issues, defining to delete old provisions allowing the wife to sign petitions using the husband's name. Let's see. Additionally, adds provisions to Senator John Lowe's LB 313, updating the procedures for filing vacant congressional seats. Third, it has Senator Holloran's LB 269. This bill would restore the restricting timelines that had been established in 2021. Those of you who were at the time may remember that we ended up with a delay in the 2020 census, and the numbers and the process there was somewhat challenging and scrambled. This bill was designed to fix that. There's no oppositions to either LB 269 or LB 313 in the hearings. Colleagues, I'd ask that you move forward AM 853. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Brewer. Mr. Clerk, for items.
Mr. President, I have AM 1801 from Senator Brewer with a note that he wishes to withdraw and substitute for, Senator Conrad's AM 1013 with a note that she wishes to withdraw for Senator Brewer's AM 1801.
No objections, so ordered.
In that case, Mr. President, Senator Brewer would offer AM 1801.
Senator Brewer, you're recognized to open on the amendment.
Yeah. Well, I just got the amendment handed to me. All right. Let's just go back for a second and get everybody in the right mindset. I opened originally on 514. 514 was the original committee priority, one of two priorities, one being LB 535, which was voter ID. 514 was our election reform bill. And of course, the AM was part of that election reform. As a result, we have had to gut LB 514, so there will be no election reform on those issues that I talked about. What we will now do is substitute LB or AM 1801. Let's go back and understand how we got here with 1801, which is voter ID. We started this process literally the first day of session. Hearings on starting on 1 February. We had three major bills. We had Senator Slama's, we had Senator Day's, we had Senator Ergman's. All three of those received incredible participation from the public. Some of the comments that Senator Conrad made are spot on, that we had a very challenging situation just because of the sheer volume. When you fill the entire hearing room and you fill the overflow room and you still have people in the hall, that's an indicator you got a long day. But that's good. That's the second house. That's what this place has been designed to do, is to hear that second house. So we did, and we stayed late, and we heard folks with a lot of different opinions when it comes to voter ID. But we had to kind of stay focused on the very limited mission at hand. How do we move forward with voter ID in a manner to give the people what they asked for, and not to make it so restrictive that we are going to burden some from being able to vote? That challenge is what we worked on for about 109 days. The primary tool was going to be 535, and 535 went through a lot of motions to get to what you see in the black binder there. In mind, the green copy, the original bill, was traded out essentially on the day of the hearing. And looking back on it, it was probably my fault that I didn't stop the hearing there and reset it for a different day, because everyone who came to that hearing came to hear that bill, that green copy bill, and to do the change as the bill is about to be heard wasn't fair to them, and it wasn't fair to the committee, quite frankly. But you cannot take hundreds of people and tell them to go back into the winter in Nebraska and come back on another day. That's not fair to them. They had came that day, and we still had a very active discussion about voter ID. What happened then is there were elements of the white copy that was dropped that day that were not going to go anywhere. The idea of having to have a notary was going to be too cumbersome, especially for the rural counties that had only voter ID mail-in ballots. So we started a process to try and sort through that. That included addressing the issue of whether or not the IDs need to be current or not. And at a point, I made the decision. This is not Bob Evans making a decision. I made the decision that we needed to have a committee bill. We need to have a plan B. I felt it was just wrong-headed for us to move forward and have only one option. And that's when we started to try and figure out how can we build something that isn't too restrictive, that does everything we needed to do, that the Attorney General can defend and that the Secretary of State can implement. And it has been a very long and difficult process. You've heard a lot of discussion today. Is it a perfect bill? Probably not. But I think that we have had a lot of reviews by a lot of good legal minds that have looked at it and have made a determination that we have something that can be made into law here in Nebraska and not violate any constitutionality. And that's essentially what you're being told right now, is that you got my way or the highway on this with constitutionality. I don't believe that to be true. There is no reason for us to have some of the legal minds that we have in this building and have them look at this and not run up a red flag if there was one. And we haven't had that. Now, on the details of the bill, as you've seen from this morning, we're going to get a chance to go into them in more detail. I think the issue of the actual ability to vote and who can and can't vote is a legitimate issue. But I think if you dig into both bills, you'll be surprised to find some of the things that are in there. And that ultimately is the burden that you have on you this afternoon. Our challenge is going to be this. If we make changes to this amendment, it is a ripple effect that we have to be careful of in other parts of the bill. And I believe we've got a good bill that can move forward and that we will be allowed to finish our time here in this body and not go into a special session. And I know that's being threatened as something that you're going to have to deal with. You don't have to deal with it. If there's something about this bill that's unconstitutional, I invite the Attorney General or any legal mind who is being fair and open in their look at this to come and allow us to hear that, because I think that's the bottom line, is if we get around the issue of whether or not it's the constitutionality, but the rest of it is simply the Secretary of State being able to execute the plan that we have given them. And I have worked with them. I do not deny it, but I believe it was part of our responsibility to work with them. And I have invited them to meetings that we've had with the exec committee, because again, I think we have done a disservice to the people of Nebraska if we burden them, whether it be financially with a bill that is not necessary, or if we put burdens on them that also limit who can vote. And again, it's thread the needle. It's not easy business. I would have probably be willing to give this job away to any of the other chairs at some point during this, because there may not be a perfect answer in this, but what we have, I think, is going to allow us to have voter ID come to the people of Nebraska in this session. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Brewer. Senator Slama, you're recognized to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Brewer. Thank you, Mr. President. I'm so sorry. It's been a long day and it's not even noon yet. And thank you, Chairman Brewer, for your thoughtful comments. And again, I don't envy your position, and I still consider you to be a good friend, and you've had my six when I've needed you, and I appreciate that. if we're going to talk about process and procedure and what happened behind the scenes, I'm more than happy to have that discussion. I find a far more convincing argument to be the constitutional issues with the Evnen Amendment and the ways that we can address that through the 3 simple changes I'm proposing. This isn't my way or the highway. This is, I'm on board with the Evnen Amendment if you make these 3 simple changes that address my concerns and ensures that we're not implementing a voter ID framework without the voter ID. I don't care who gets the credit. I want to pass a constitutional bill that does right by the voters. So if we are going to talk about process and procedure, I will touch on that because I think it is important. So it's important to note that the Evnen Amendment was dropped and it didn't have the same amount of review, clearly, that my amendment had. In the negotiations, the reason why there were so many iterations of the bill is that we were taking those small changes that we needed to make between the different departments from DMV to the Secretary of State's office that we thought, and they were mostly being made in good faith. It's been analyzed by the Attorney General's office and everybody else in this building that has a vested interest in the outcome of this. So what's different about the Evnen Amendment is this was crafted between the chairman of the government committee and the Secretary of State's office without the input of the committee, without the involvement of the committee, unless other people were involved, and I think they might have been without me knowing, in meetings that happened without me knowing, without it being vetted by these different departments, without anything. And it was sold that this amendment is a clean amendment, and that's because the Secretary of State, Bob Evnen, told you that it was. There's a reason that this amendment is 30 pages compared to my own amendment, which is 72, and it's because there are very clear, very obvious constitutional issues that when you have a strict voter ID law and constitutional framework that you have to take into account, and the Evnen Amendment simply doesn't do that. So I'm encouraging a red vote on this amendment because it's going to force us all to come to a table and iron out these differences and iron out the core constitutional issues that I see with this bill. When I'm saying these 3 issues, are those all the issues I have with the Evnen Amendment? Absolutely not. But I'm highlighting these 3 as the things that need to be fixed. Otherwise, we've just staggered our way into a special session because the courts will throw this out. Like, get up and tell me that Section 5 does not violate the National Voter Registration Act and tell me why. Tell me that Sections 10 through 11 don't place an undue burden on fundamental right to vote when we have a case directly on point. And it also violates the amendment passed by voters allowing non-exempt persons to vote without showing an ID. It's far too expansive and flies in the face of the constitutional amendment language. Argue that I'm wrong when I say that the religious objection language in Section 12 isn't only too expansive in that we're saying anybody can say they have a religious objection and they don't even need to show an ID, much less a photo ID in order to vote, but also that they have to re-register in every single election cycle. Get up and tell me that somehow sections 17 through 19 don't violate the fundamental right to vote or the equal protection law when you have one of the most famous election law cases in our country's history, Bush v. Gore, exactly on point with the problems you have when you set different standards when it comes to reasonable impediment language. And tell me that Section 23 somehow doesn't violate the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment when we're creating 2 different classes of citizens, those who are born in Nebraska and get to use the Secretary of State's services to get them the documentation they need to vote, or those who happen to be born outside of Nebraska that now have to pay a poll tax in order to vote. I am asking to address these 3 simple issues, address these constitutional issues so that we can move forward. But until then, I'm going to ask you to vote no on the amendment on the board. It is the Evnen Amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Slama. Seeing no one else in the queue, Senator Brewer, you're recognized to close on AM 1801.
Thank you, Mr. President. Again, I need to stress to you that we have a committee process here. And this has been a longer committee process than any other committee in the legislature. If you look at the number of hours that we have spent in hearings on voter ID, you look at the hours spent in review of the voter ID policy, the working lunches, the time over lunch that we just spent in discussion, and then the final two votes, we will nullify a voter ID process that the committee has gone through tremendous pains to find the way to thread things and get it right. If we didn't have a legal counsel, if we didn't have a Secretary of State, if we didn't have an AG to look at these things, then I would say, yeah, let's be concerned. But we do. And, you know, I am wore down from this process and would like to see us move forward with 1801 and get voter ID to the people that have asked for it. With that, thank you, Mr. President, and ask you to vote for 1801 and ultimately 514.
Thank you, Senator Brewer. Members, the question is the adoption of AM 1801. All those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote nay. Record, Mr. Clerk.
32 ayes, 3 nays on the adoption of the amendment, Mr. President.
The amendment is not adopted. Is adopted, excuse me. Okay. Mr. Clerk, for items.
Mr. President, some items. Your Committee on Enrollment Review reports Legislative Bill 531A, 562A, 705A, 727A to select file. Additionally, amendments to be printed for Senator Breezy to LB 243A, and Senator Sanders to LB 583A. Finally, Mr. President, priority motion. Senator Albright would move to recess the body until 1:00 p.m.
Senators, you've heard the motion to recess. All those in favor, say aye. All those opposed, nay. We are in recess.